President Carter and Rosalynn. What genuine people they were that dedicated their whole life to the cause of justice, peace, and human rights. The passage of time has put a whole different light on his whole life, but also his presidency. The benefit of 40-some-odd years has given us the perspective to see better than the shorthand version of a failed presidency because he lost a general election. The many years since he left the White House have given new meaning to his White House years because of the way he's lived his life since.
Welcome to 2036, the podcast. I am Cutler Andrews. I am fortunate today to sit down with Terry Adamson. Terry Adamson has been a member of the Board of Trustees and the Executive Committee of the Carter Center since the inception. He has served as personal attorney of President and Mrs. Carter since 1981. A partner of prominent law firms in Atlanta and Washington for many years. He was a senior official in the U.S. Department of Justice, 1977 to 1979. He previously served as executive vice president of the National Geographic Society and retired as vice president of global law affairs and general counsel of Boeing International in October 2020. He's also a double eagle for Emory, graduating with his BA in history in 1968 and his JD in 1973. Terry, welcome. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Delighted to be here.
Tell us a little bit about your journey to Emory. How did you get to Emory? How did you decide to pick that as your undergraduate degree?
It was an exciting journey and a surprising one because I was a high school debater and we were a very competitive debate team. And we were a participant in the massive debate partner that the Barclay Forum held at Emory. It was the most prestigious tournament at that time. And in my senior year, we won a number of awards, and I was named outstanding participant of the Barclay Forum that year. And that at that time, the outstanding participant received a full tuition debate scholarship to Emory. That quickly focused my attention on Emory. It was an aspiration before that. It was a realization of an aspiration after that. The debate coach at Emory was a magnificent debate coach, Glenn Pelham, who had an interesting high school career, and then he was also a state senator representing Cairo, Georgia, or Grady County in the Georgia General Assembly. Anticipate your question. That's what led to Jimmy Carter.
Oh, and that's where I was going next. So I wanted to dive in to talk about your first time for meeting President Carter.
Well, it was by the grace of Glenn Pelham, who loved ceremony and built the debate program at Emory in the Barclay Forum by a lot of ceremonious things, one of which was to take this winning debate team to the Georgia General Assembly for us to be recognized as a Georgia school that won this national debate tournament. And so the entire team went with Mr. Pelham. Mr. Pelham introduced us to Jimmy Carter. That was my first meeting. And on the basis of that meeting, when I did get to Emory, I was active in the Young Democrats and became president of the Young Democrats, which was about 20 people. And we invited Jimmy Carter, who was then running for the Congress. And he came to Emory, drove from Plains, spoke to the Young Democrats, and drove back to Plains that night. We had a nice time together, that late afternoon event, and I felt like I had formed a decent relationship with him. And shortly after that, he switched from running for Congress to running for governor. Ellis Arnold, another former governor who was seen as more liberal, was already in the race, and I had already taken a job to work in that campaign that summer of 1966. And so as it turned out, Carter and I would encounter each other a fair amount at various campaign events where candidates were brought together. That is something he distinctly remembers and makes a very exaggerated view of my abilities in debates where I would be a stand-in for Ellis Arnold. But Carter characterizes this as the Lincoln-Douglas debates of another era, and that he was being outshone by this champion debater from Emory. He tells that story a lot.
Well, and President Carter talks about originally when you two met, you weren't supporting him. How did that evolve over time? And you were supporting another candidate, but eventually you came to be obviously really close to President Carter and his family. So how did that relationship evolve?
I think he had a decent respect for me. It just turned out I was committed when he chose to run. I was never not proud of my candidate, Governor Arnold. He ran a great campaign. He's a great man. Carter himself was very impressed with Governor Arnold. In 1970, I was a reporter. I couldn't be partisan. I was not partisan. I liked Carter. I spent a fair amount of time with Carter on the campaign trail. I thought our coverage was fair and honorable and not necessarily harsh. We're just reporters. We were trying to be fair and accurately report the campaign. But he associated me with the editorial policies, and so he considered that I was opposed. I wasn't really, and we often rode around in a car with Jody Powell driving. We'd go from a civic club to a town to a shopping mall. So I got to spend a lot of time with the gubernatorial candidate Carter at that time.
I mean, President Carter was seen in some cases as an underdog. He was not as well known as many other candidates. At what point did you start seeing something unique, something different, something that was going to grow into this person who could become president?
I didn't think of it in those terms, someone who might become president. I didn't have the vision for that. Others did maybe, but it wasn't me. But I did see in him a great humanity. I saw the human person that people have come to know over the years. And it wasn't a surprise to me. It really wasn't. I was still a reporter when it occurred, when in his inaugural address, he said the time to end segregation is now, and in 1970 was a huge statement for a governor in his inaugural address to make. One who had really run as a more conservative image in 1970, which was successful politically, but it was a surprise to a lot of people, but frankly, it wasn't a surprise to me. He had people walk out of that inauguration ceremony because he said that, but it was important, and it meant a lot in Georgia, particularly after the Maddox years, and it got national attention. He landed on the cover of Time magazine as the new breed of Southern governor. And, we watched his time as governor, which was significant, but it was a one term. But he decided, not known to me at the time, to run for president. He had good people around him with vision that could help him do that. And part of it was his comparing himself to the other potential candidates. He met a lot of them as governor. They would come visit. Ted Kennedy visited him at the governor's mansion. He was going to make a big law day speech at the University of Georgia. And Carter was also going to make a speech. Turned out that Carter's speech became extremely noteworthy. It was off the cuff. It was a very populist speech, and it was talking a lot about how the poor are discriminated against, not just because of race, but because of poverty, and why it was other people's responsibilities to do something about it. That's when he started quoting Nietzsche and Tillich and Bob Dylan. And Kennedy made his speech, but it was Carter's speech got all the attention because it happened that Hunter Thompson, who was a reporter for Rolling Stone magazine, was present, drinking his tea, probably laced with severe quantities of bourbon. But he wrote an amazing article that gave Carter, as a national figure and as a human figure, great resonance with a lot of the rest of the country. And it was turned out to be very important in his campaign. And it was such a contrast to Kennedy, who was sort of more canned, less passionate. It was a different role.
Well, in that line, the time to end segregation is now. It was such a pivotal and important statement. You and I were talking earlier about the kind of the impetus of that statement, where it kind of came from. Can you talk a little bit about the backstory around it, but also why it was so important at the time?
Well, the backstory behind it, which we now know, and some of Carter's biographers have reported this story from the principals themselves, Jimmy Carter, and a pilot, not an airline pilot, but he had his own personal plane, and he was Carter's pilot during the 1970s gubernatorial campaign. I had known him in 1966 because he was a volunteer pilot for the Ellis Arnold campaign, which is probably where Carter got to know him first, but he volunteered his services. David is an extraordinary man. He grew up in Savannah. He had done pretty well as a Jewish businessman in Savannah, and he was active politically. He was particularly active with the civil rights community and had personal friends at the top of the civil rights community. And one of his roles in the Carter campaign in 1970, which was below the radar, and we only know now, was as a liaison for Carter to important figures like Dr. King Sr., Coretta King, Andy Young, Hosea Williams, all friends of David Rabhan. But Rabhan was his pilot, and Carter knew he was going to win. He was the Democratic nominee against a Republican newscaster named Hal Soot. But Rabhan was flying on some last flight. Carter was riding up in the cockpit with him. Carter said, "Well, David, you've done this for me. You've given me all of this effort on my behalf to become governor. I'm about to be elected governor. What can I do for you? Surely there's something I can do for you that would be meaningful." Rabhan said, "No, there's nothing you can do for me." Carter persisted, and finally Rabhan said, "Yes, Governor, if you want to do something for me, you can say in your inaugural address, the time to end segregation is now." Carter thought about it, and he said, "Okay, I'll do it." And he said, "Write it down." The only thing I had to write on was an airplane flight map. And he wrote these words on the map, and he had Carter sign it and date it. And that was the beginning of what took place on Inauguration Day in 1971.
So you started your career in journalism and then decided to go back to law school. What kind of provoked that transition to law school?
Well, I was headed to law school right out of Emory College as a history major, and I had been accepted several schools. That was the year 1968 of my graduation that all deferments ended into the military, so I had to deal with a military obligation that was likely to interrupt graduate schooling. So I did that. I was able to get into the reserve unit and had active duty, basic training, and advanced infantry training in a number of months. But that timing set me off from going the next cycle to law school. I happen to have met a man named Reg Murphy when I was editor of the Emory Wheel, who was out on campuses trying to understand what students were thinking and doing about the war and other things. And I applied for a job at the Atlanta Constitution, and lo and behold, I got a job as a cub reporter. And I liked it. I enjoyed it. I was learning a lot. I had mentors in the newsroom. I learned a lot from a lot of people in the newsroom. I knew I was growing a lot there. It's something that was meaningful and interesting to me. So I decided, maybe I'll be a journalist. So I did that a while. And I was also inspired by Watergate that was going on at that time. A lot of the better journalists who were covering Watergate were also lawyers, people like Carl Stern and Fred Graham. And that inspired me, too. I said, whichever way I go, law school would be valuable. So I decided to go to Emory because I was also continuing to work at the newspaper, the Atlanta Constitution, part-time while I was a first-year law student the whole year. And it helped on income, but it also helped me sort of still straddle what I was most interested in. And part of that time, I was still covering the 70 gubernatorial campaign. Went out the last weekend with the Carters, that last weekend of the campaign, which was very interesting.
During Carter's presidency, he talks about leading with compassion and competency. How did you see that embodied in his administration?
I wasn't at the White House. I had clerked after law school for a U.S. Court of Appeals judge named Griffin Bell, who it turned out became Carter's attorney general. I had just returned from a fellowship year abroad where I worked as a lawyer in Tokyo, Japan, so I'd missed most of the campaign. Saw Carter rise from a candidate to the nominee and then the ultimate winner of the election. But I got back to Atlanta in that fall. The election was still going on. Carter was well ahead. It began to narrow considerably. But when he won in November, the loudest sound in town were suitcases slapping shut, but I didn't think mine was going to be one of them. I didn't feel like I'd earned it because I'd been gone. But Judge Bell had need for help and reached out. There were a number of former law clerks to him that gathered together. I was among them, and we became part of his team thereafter. We went through a difficult confirmation battle, and then we served as senior officials of the department. I was one of his special assistants, and we shared liaison roles to a good bit of the Department of Justice. So later became the official spokesperson for the Justice Department.
Yeah, that was one of my favorite stories when I read around one of your briefings you sent over that he had to make a correction on for Attorney General.
One of my little jobs in the office wasn't such a little job, but it was one I took very seriously. We had together the material for the Attorney General's report to the President, which was under the President Carter's system. He wanted to receive these reports in the afternoon on Friday, and by Monday morning they would come back marked up or with questions or added for additional material. This particular report went over, and I had a typo in it. I had misspelled the word general. I had spelled it Genetal. And Carter, in his unmistakable hand, wrote over on the side of it, it's Genital.
Oh, yeah.
And of course, I was humiliated. This report goes all over the White House. It goes all over the Justice Department, correcting my typography. Everyone knew that I was the original draftsman of these reports. And Judge Bell would read them, and other people would read them before we sent it over. But this mistake stayed in it, and it became legendary.
That is great. You have deep roots with Emory, but Carter didn't necessarily. What was the impetus for that relationship between the Carters and Emory University?
Jim Laney, while he was president, Carter came to Emory and participated in a graduation ceremony. It was a big deal, obviously, with the President of the United States to be a part of the Emory commencement. But very soon after Carter left office, and he wasn't in the best frame of mind, he had been soundly defeated. He had been informed, he'd put all of his personal businesses and planes and a blind trust. But it hadn't done well because of a number of things, inflation among them. So he considered himself broke. He had a responsibility to build a library and give it to the federal government, deed it to the federal government. But he had to bear the cost. That was the law at that time. We had an estimated $25 million goal. And Jim Laney reached out to President Carter and invited him to become a distinguished faculty member of Emory University. And Carter accepted and was thrilled by it. He didn't know how much he was going to be thrilled, I think, because he loved it.
And that was the beginning of the partnership which developed the Carter Center.
That's correct.
So it was originally part of the Woodruff Library, but you were really instrumental in actually building it to kind of this iconic place it is now. Talk a little bit about kind of that transition from the idea of the Carter Center to the Woodruff Library to where it is currently in Atlanta.
There was always the notion that it would be somewhere other than at Emory, but because he was a professor at Emory and there was this nice facility in the Woodruff Library, that was a good place to start. He also had an office at the Russell Building in downtown, which the government provided former presidents to do their former president duties, which is basically answer mail and transition to a private life. I hesitate to use the word instrumental. That I was there and I played a part in it, and I was proud to do so, and it was a labor of love. I had already become, in effect, one of the president's lawyers, but they had identified this 17 acres that the Carter Center sits on, which was in shambles as a deserted real estate. It had been condemned for a 4-lane highway that would run from downtown Atlanta to Stone Mountain and connect to the perimeter. It was very much wanted by the Department of Transportation, but Carter, as governor, actually killed it. And it was in response to the lack of planning for the neighborhoods involved, as he saw it at that time. The state approached him, and it was done with Mr. Tom Moreland, who was the commissioner of the Department of Transportation for the state of Georgia, Mr. Kerbo, Bob Lipschutz, and I became involved. That piece of land was available, but it had to be used as a roadside park to a highway because it was condemned for a highway transportation purpose. And it was fairly complicated. And the notion of another road inflamed the neighborhoods again. And as much as we tried to ameliorate those concerns, it didn't really quiet the ire of the neighborhoods. So there was a lot of opposition, and we ended up in litigation over it. There were other complications. We had to acquire property elsewhere that the state wanted for a transportation purpose and swap it for the land the state owned through condemnation, where the footprint of the library and what is now the Carter Center would be. So there was that element of it. There was times when construction started on the Carter Center, they got stopped because protesters would actually chain themselves to the trees to protest the building of this road. I mean, it was all heartfelt. There was a good people. John Asia's father was the leader of one of the neighborhood groups. I had a lot of contact and dealings, respectful during that time. But it was a difficult issue, and Carter was sort of bound to support the state if we were going to access it, although he was extremely delighted when it finally settled in a very nice way. The building of the road around the library comes to an end shortly thereafter, and all that land, including the land surrounding this part of the road, is very well landscaped, cared for, bike paths, jogging paths, and then there's a lot of parkland that's created after it ends. So it came to a good resolution, but it was a difficult several-year period. Construction was started, it stopped, started again, and it was finally October the 1st, President's birthday, 1986, that it came to be dedicated.
It's amazing to watch the Carter Center because if you look at what they've done in terms of the eradication of guinea worm, the role they've played in international human rights and political monitoring and making sure there are free and safe elections, how do you see the Carter Center in this mission as really a continuation of what President Carter kind of outlined in his administration's goals and responsibilities?
Well, the programs of the Carter Center really are fulfillment of things he started as president. The peace, the conflict resolution, mental health, the health programs, the work they're doing on elections and democracy. It's amazing, and it's far beyond probably what any of us ever envisioned it would be. It revolved around him and Rosalynn to a large extent for so many years. They put their heart and soul 24 hours a day into it, but it had to evolve over time into more of an institution that could succeed on its own without the Carters. One element of it, of course, is the partnership that it formed with Emory in the early 1990s. When Jim Laney retired, there was Dean Fry became the acting president of Emory. And Dean Fry really started the initiative with some of his trustees and with the president to say, why don't we formalize this relationship with Emory? And over the course of that year, and I was doing it for President Carter and with President Carter. And we were able to structure a very interesting partnership formally where Carter Center became, in effect, a subsidiary of Emory University, like the medical school, like the law school, or any other school. But it was important to President Carter and the trustees of Emory that it needed to maintain its own identity, not as a study place, but as a place of action. And I think in these agreements we've accomplished that. It has worked very, very, very well. It has a governing board that consists of 10 Carter-named trustees and 10 appointed by the chairman of the board of trustees of Emory and ex officio the president of Emory University. Yeah. That board, it works as one. It really does. And it's amazing to see it operate and be a part of it. And the involvement of the various presidents of Emory University since, they contribute so much. And Emory, I still don't think we've realized the full potential of that partnership. But I know FinViz is very committed to that. And the new president of the Carter Center is also committed to that. And I think that's going to be one of the manifestations that's already taking shape. There's already many more collaborations. And I'm hopeful myself that one area that's in the future to develop is mental health. It's always been a significant goal of the Carter Center. It goes back to Rosalynn Carter. I recall when I flew that last weekend of the gubernatorial campaign with President Carter, he was telling me about Rosalynn, what she wanted to work on. And she was out campaigning separately, always from him, and I was usually with him. He told me then, on that airplane going back from Augusta to Atlanta, that Rosalynn was committing herself to mental health. And she did that as First Lady of Georgia. She did it as First Lady of the United States. And she's definitely done it as his partner and First Lady of the Carter Center from its creation.
And you brought it up, as you really can't talk about President Carter without talking about Mrs. Carter as well, and her influence on policy and different areas of focus. And talk a little bit more about how Mrs. Carter kind of helped shape some of the administrative priorities, but also the priorities of the Carter Center. It goes beyond just mental health.
It does go far beyond mental health. It's really a statement about their faith, which is strong and deep, their marriage and love, which is strong and deep, and the partnership they formed. And I think it evolved too. I'm not sure she was in on everything at the beginning. One big story they talk about is that he decided that he would quit the Navy and move back to planes, which she was devastated over. She had just gotten out of planes. She was a young woman. She was enjoying the world. They were living in Hawaii at the time. She enjoyed the very different life that they had in Southwest Georgia. And he had just quit all that, apparently without discussion, as they've retold it many times, to move back when his father died to take over the family business. That's pretty good evidence that they weren't on the same plane they later became during his governorship, the campaigns, the presidency, and in the Carter Center. But I've had the opportunity to travel there many times, and it is always a touching scene when they're holding hands walking out to go swimming in the morning before their day starts. And she has been frequently present. She was a force in the White House. There's no question about it. She attended quite a while cabinet meetings just to stay informed, but she got a lot of heat for that. It really made a new era of a different kind of first lady. And it was certainly true in the campaigns, where she became quite an effective campaigner. And then clearly in the partnership with the Carter Center, not just in mental health, but in every program they're doing. And you virtually never saw him travel alone, unless Rosalynn had her own trip to do for her interest. They were together, and they were deciding things together and doing things together, including the non-Carter Center activity they often are identified with as Habitat for Humanity, which they joined and became spokespeople for in the 80s, literally devoted a week a year to building houses and doing those programs and standing for all over the world. And a lot of people think of that as a symbol of their work, although is very important, and Habitat accomplishes incredible things. It's a tribute to their marriage and their love.
One of the things that I'm fortunate to do in my position is I meet with alums all over the country, around the world. And one of the things that I hear so often is a tradition that they value. It is one of the few things that people, if you've experienced, you go back to it and you remember it. They talk about it in such fondness. What was the genesis for the Carter Town Hall? How has it evolved over the years? And what do you really hope students take from it in this kind of new evolution?
1982 it started. Obviously, the freshman class of 1982 had an experience that was unlike entering any university or college in the world. You had a former president of the United States there on one of your opening weeks of being on campus, and it was a distinguished professor at Emory University, and you would see him around campus. There he was holding forth any subject they wanted to talk about or answer any question they wanted to ask. For that to be repeated year after year after year, for all those many years, for entering freshmen of Emory University, and you'd have several thousand students would be gathered together to partake in this experience. It was unlike any university experience in the world. President Carter's participation was going to have to end at some point after 30 some odd years, 38 years or whatever the number is. But that experience you wanted to replicate as best you can in his name and his honor and Rosalyn's honor forever. And thrilled that Emory has determined to do that. Carter Center supports it. Individuals support it. And the idea is to bring a person truly engaged and something meaningful that might be inspirational for students, not only about the values manifested by these individuals, but also by the fact that a person can make a difference. An individual can make a difference.
Yeah. When you think about future students coming to Carter Town Hall who may not have experienced him in any sort of way, but they come to this unique event, how do you hope the President and Mrs. Carter's legacy is evident in future Carter Town Halls?
That bears her name. That's pretty evident. I've attended the last several as we transitioned when Jason spoke and Andy Young and Rapperhold last year. Emory has done a nice job of taking just a few excerpts, briefly showing Carter at his best in some of these meetings over the years and acquainting the new generation. This is part of the legacy that's left for them at Emory. And even though the people may change, the goals and ideals of Emory and the scholarship and the energy that comes from Emory is still there for them.
If you look at kind of the latest Gallup polls and you look at perceptions of higher education, it continues to go down. There's often talk that it's not as relevant as it used to be. People are questioning the value of higher education. But it was obviously something that President Carter was very committed to, enough to come back and be a professor. Why do you think higher education, having a strong higher education system, was so important to President Carter?
I mean, he valued education. I mean, he actually attended several universities. He went to Georgia Southwestern for a year. He was already interested in the Naval Academy, but his local congressman who had appointments to make to the Naval Academy told him his math wasn't strong enough from what the education he had received to date. He had had a teacher in Plains, Georgia, who had inspired him to the value of knowledge, the value of inquisition. So he went to Georgia Southwestern. He took other mathematic courses to prepare for the Naval Academy at Georgia Tech. And ultimately at the Naval Academy, he finally entered as a freshman at the very end of World War II. And he knows the value of that education to him. And commitment to education, of course, is one of the hallmarks of his presidency. He created the Department of Education. He sought to increase federal funding for schools all over the country. And the fact of becoming a professor was truly appealing to him. He resented a little bit that he didn't get tenure for a long time. He was a distinguished professor, and I guess 33 books was enough, and they finally gave him tenure. But he treasured his time at Emory. He just loved it. He talked about it a lot. I saw him in action quite a few times on campus, meeting with graduate students or speaking to a law school class or speaking generally or just going around and doing things that people on campus do. He liked that. He really liked it. He really enjoyed it, and he appreciated that part of his life.
There's so many people who've worked with President Carter over the years in the administrations, when he was governor, when he was president at the Carter Center. But you all have developed a very unique bond, a lifelong friendship. When did that kind of evolve from a professional relationship to this more personal kind of ongoing relationship? You've been heavily involved in a lot of his key initiatives here, and he obviously trusts you and your insights and your leadership around this. When did you see that transition?
It's hard to say. I valued my time with him. It was a labor of love. He knew it. I was lucky and very fortunate to form that friendship, and I spent a lot of time with him and Rosalynn and cared for them a lot, and they cared for me a lot. I don't know when it moved from A to B. I think one part of it probably was exemplified when we dedicated the Carter Center on October 1. Mr. Curbo, who was really his closest friend and an attorney and brilliant man, when we dedicated the center, Mr. Curbo said, "I have a gift for you." And he wanted me to go out to the top ponds out by the center of the lake. And he had placed in there, and he said, "These are for me, 2 plastic flamingos." And I have a wonderful picture of that, of giving me those 2 plastic flamingos, and I treasure it because coming from Mr. Curbo, that was the ultimate compliment. ultimate compliment to me was paid by Carter when he, only 2 months after Mr. Kerbo had passed away, wrote a birthday letter that was read at a reunion of Justice Department people and said, "In many ways, you have come in my mind and heart to replace Charlie Kerbo." Just to say that now tugs me pretty hard because that's the ultimate compliment from the man I love and respect.
And he has such incredible legacy. And he has done so much, as well as Mrs. Carter. If you had to distill their legacy down in kind of a short summary, what would you want people to remember about President and Mrs. Carter?
What genuine people they were that dedicated their whole life to the cause of justice, peace, and health. And he would say, President Carter would say, human rights. That is something he thinks about every single day. What I really appreciate right now is the fact that the passage of time has put a whole different light on his whole life, but also his presidency. We've had 2 major biographies of Carter published within the last 2 or 3 years, one by Jonathan Alter and one by Kai Bird. Both are extraordinary books, biographies, captures of the life of Jimmy and Rosalynn Carter. One of the things that they both focus on a lot is a whole retake on their presidency, that the benefit of 40 some odd years has given us the perspective to see better and to see that is more consequential than the shorthand version of a failed presidency because he lost badly a general election. And I think he's had the benefit, particularly since he entered into hospice, and there's been a lot of commentary and discussion about Carter's record. The fact that when he was president, he was new to the scene. People really didn't know him very well. It was not their fault. He just hadn't been there. They now know him pretty well. And the many years since he left the White House have given new meaning to his White House years because of the way he's lived his life since. People see him as genuine to what he was then, when they may have been quick to discount it as just the sayings of another politician. But they see a person in their full life, especially the significant life after the White House, that has given meaning to what he was discussing and talking about and raising with people then.
When he left the White House, did you foresee this lifelong passion for human rights, international work, diplomacy work? Because it's very unique for a former president to be that involved on the global scale in the way that he's been.
Yeah, I think he's surprised everybody.
Yeah.
We knew it would be something. He was a persevering, committed man and wife. You expected something from the 2 of them, and you had hopes, but you didn't know. And I'm not sure they knew at that point. They began with dreams of maybe creating a center for conflict resolution on the model of Camp David where people could be brought together. But those dreams have exploded. I mean, it wasn't until 1988 that they took on the guinea worm, and that became the model for major roles in 6 curable diseases, solvable diseases now. Not just one, not just the guinea worm. And they have models for public health and execution of proper treatments that make a difference.
I've learned so much. You have been so impactful on Emory, on the Carters. Thank you for joining me today on 2036, the podcast, and for having me at your beautiful home for this conversation. It's truly been an honor to be with you today.
Well, it's an honor to be with you. Thank you for asking.